From Stantec, Senior Principal Ecosystem Restoration Design Engineer Mike Adams. Mike is a civil water resources engineer who has been deploying nature-based solutions for stream restoration and resilient stormwater management, including geomorphic stream design, process-based natural channel design, fluvial geomorphology, dam removal and stream assessment for more than 27 years. He's worked on highly urban and large-scale projects across the United States, and he serves as a discipline lead and subject matter expert in stream restoration for Stantec. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our first speaker for the day, Mr. Mike Adams. Kia ora, Mike.
Thank you. E ako hua kai manawa, e na uri ona ti whakauawe, me kia te arawa whanui, e tia kiana I te mana, me te mai o tata tutui, karanga mai, mihi mai, whakato maira. Uri noa e tutato fore, kana iwi o te moto, teina kotu, teina hoki tata ukatoa. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here to talk to you today. I don't have any advice on disposing of bodies or anything like that, but I am going to give you, over the next 45 minutes or so, sort of a perspective of nature-based solutions from the perspective of a stream restoration practitioner. And as was mentioned, I've been doing this for a little bit over 25 years, and again, it's just a pleasure to be here to share some of my experience with you. Back when I was in college, first couple years I was studying engineering, and I took a class on the history of science. And one of the books we were assigned to read in this class was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. This was written back in the early 1960s. And up until that point, I didn't really have exposure to how scientific paradigms were formed. And this book kind of really changed my perspective. And it made me make kind of a bad decision to go from engineering to history, but I later rectified that decision and came back to engineering later on so I could get a job. But it discussed really how paradigms are formed and how they become collective ways of thinking, how scientific groups identify themselves, how they go about solving problems, sort of their core beliefs in how they view certain scientific challenges. In thinking about nature-based solutions, I thought, well, this is kind of what this is becoming in our practice. This is a way of viewing problems, a way of solving problems. And that's really what nature-based solutions, I think, at least means to me and to a lot of my colleagues who are out there right now trying to solve a lot of the problems that we have with degraded streams really across the globe. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on right now. But let's start with a definition of nature-based solutions. This is the definition according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And they define them as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. That's kind of a nice definition, but really what I want to do is kind of focus on nature-based solutions as a way of problem solving and as a foundation for making decisions. Okay? My youngest daughter's getting ready to go to college later this year. She's going to study engineering, and when she asked me about kind of what we do, I explained to her that really engineering is about solving problems. That's really what we as a community are doing. And in my experience, the engineers who are the best at solving problems are the ones who make good decisions along the way. So, there's kind of an arc that we all follow when we get a project. We think about what it is we need to do to design the project to solve whatever problem that we are confronted with. And really, it's how do we make decisions along the way? How do we decide that we're going to solve these problems? And so in the stream restoration world, there's ways that we look at problems. There's certain methods that we follow to understand what's happening in the system, and then ways that we go about trying to figure out a way to fix it. And nature-based solutions then really becomes kind of a template for how we design. We focus on natural processes, and we focus on how the system is responding to these processes. But beyond the part of the landscape, it's also embracing and acknowledging the fact that there are people out there who know a lot more about these systems than we do. Embracing the native communities, the traditional ecological knowledge. There's a wealth of knowledge out there that if we don't listen, we're going to miss it. And the design is not going to be what it needs, and we're not going to give back to the landscape what it needs. And so that's an important piece of nature-based solutions as well. So it's not just a philosophical way of looking at the river and deciding what we need to do with it, but it's opening up our ears so that we can listen. When it comes to employing nature-based solutions, it's really kind of the central tenet, I think, is to work with nature and not against it. This is a photograph that, if you attend stream restoration conferences, you probably see this at least once a session. This is a photograph of the Walla Walla River in the western United States. And what they did here is they took a meandering river and they tried to straighten it. And a big flood hit, and as you can see in this picture, the river decided, no, I'm not going to be straight. It's going to meander. That's how it responds to the way that water moves across the landscape as it starts to meander. And so understanding how these processes shape the river is critical. And the linkage between those driving processes and how the river responds is really at the core of how we're employing nature-based solutions to solve problems. And so when I step back and think about river design and geomorphic approaches to river design, it's viewing the river as, if you think about it as a response mechanism, that a river is just a response to the way that water and sediment and wood move across the landscape, driven only by gravity and affected by biological inputs. So if you have a river in a given state and you change the amount of water, you increase the amount of water flowing into the system, there's going to be a response. If the sediment load changes, there's going to be a concomitant response as well. If you take all the wood out of the system, the river's going to respond in a certain way. If you add more wood to the system, the river's going to respond a certain way. Same thing if beaver extirpated from the landscape, there's going to be a response to the system. So all these things affect how a river responds. And it's really up to us to understand how those processes are acting and how the river is responding to those processes. And again, it's learning to be able to read the landscape yourself, and it's also opening your ears to listen to others who have been on the landscape a lot longer. And so what I want to do here is kind of focus on 3 tenets of nature-based solutions when it comes to stream restoration design. And don't worry, I've got some stuff on wetlands too, but I'm going to mostly talk about streams because that's what I do. And I want to talk a little bit about floodplain connection, the importance of floodplain connectivity. I'm going to talk a little bit about listening to and relying on traditional ecological knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sizing channels in urban landscapes. Okay, so these are 3 things that I think are germane to a lot of problems that we're asked to solve when it comes to stream restoration. So this image is a site that we worked on in the eastern US. And the challenge here was this site had been cattle farmed. The cattle had free access to the system. They denuded the entire valley of vegetation, and what was left was this sort of straightened stream right here, not much riparian corridor. The water was not spreading out onto the floodplain. It just came out and it flowed downstream. It didn't really have time to interact with the landscape. And so our primary objective here was to try to keep that water on the landscape a little bit longer. And so what we did was we took an approach that followed the natural evolution of channels. This image is one that you see a lot in the stream restoration community. This is from a paper that was published back in 2013 by Brian Clore and Colin Thorne. And It's an expansion of an idea of channel evolution in ways that channels naturally evolve. So what I mentioned earlier about changing some of the input parameters, this summarizes how these channels will respond. And you can see these dominating processes. We've got narrowing and widening, and then we've got aggradation and degradation. Okay, so that's kind of the quadrants in which these changes occur. And what we're seeing on our site here was this pathway to degradation. Okay, so the channel was starting to incise, meaning it was separating from its floodplain. And so the water no longer had a chance to really interact with the adjacent landscape. And the damage done to the landscape, really reduced the potential for anything to be there anyway. And so what we decided we wanted to do was we wanted to return this back to a highly connected, multi-threaded system that had high connectivity with the landscape. Okay, so this again is kind of the first tenet of restoration is floodplain interaction. Floodplains are important. Floodplains are how rivers naturally dissipate energy. The energy is going to be dissipated. You have a certain amount of potential energy here. As it flows downhill, that energy becomes potential energy and is dissipated as it moves on down to the ocean. So this energy has to be dissipated in some manner. So what we did was we came up with a solution that had multiple channels. We had a primary channel and some secondary channels, and then lots of side channel features. And so what this became was a combination of stream relocation, lifting up to connect with the floodplain, and then creating additional areas adjacent to the channel for habitat improvements, for fish rearing, fantastic salamander and other amphibian habitat as well. And one of the key components of this project was wood. We were able to locate some sources of wood, so we added a lot of wood to the system. And this is an example of a bend pool in one of the sections of the channel. And this site, before we got started, was basically void of any pool habitat. So the fish really didn't have anywhere to go. The water was shallow. There wasn't much cover, so fish over there were under threat of predation from birds and other animals. And so by understanding the physics of how water moves, we utilized wood. We put the wood underwater. So notice that all this wood is underwater, so none of it's above water in this particular location. So it's all underwater. So when the energy of the water is imparted on that wood, it creates turbulence, and that turbulence creates scour. And that scour maintains that pool depth all around the bend. And so what that does is it creates depth for the fish to be able to have a place to hang out. What it also does is when the flows recede, we've got a lower energy system, and that wood provides cover for the fish to hide. So when we went back out here after a few months following construction, there were fish everywhere out here. And that was unusual for this part of the landscape. This particular site was not very far from a trout-bearing stream, and so our expectation and our hope was that some of these fish would start to move up. And by including the wood underwater, it helped that occur. And then this aerial view right here, all these little specks you see are other pieces of wood. So we spread wood all across the landscape, and we're trying to roughen the landscape. We're trying to increase the stress on the resistance to stress across the floodplain as well. So we're trying to not only pulse water out onto the landscape, but we're trying to hold it there longer. Right? There's a lot of secondary benefits that occur from that. We can recharge the groundwater. The groundwater had receded some because of the cattle pressures. So by putting water on the landscape longer and holding it there longer, we're able to improve those conditions. And this is an image following the first growing season. You can see that the aquatic vegetation has grown in all the way to the water line, right? And we've got some wood in the channel. And so the response here is what we were after. We weren't trying to foist a particular shape or form on this system. We were trying to work with these natural processes and just kind of reset it a little bit, give it some guidance. We did build a channel, but the channel it had a pathway because we were required to have it just from a regulatory perspective, but we didn't really care if it stayed over here or if it started to occupy one of these other secondary channels that we built. And this is another image from further down the valley where we've got this hyperconnectivity and lush adjacent vegetation community. So a second tenet I want to talk about is the reliance on traditional ecological knowledge and advocating for and with the indigenous communities in solving a problem. This is from a project that we're doing in the northwestern United States. It's the Lower Klamath Dam Removal Project. We're taking out, or actually they've taken out, there's 4 dams that have been removed from the Klamath River in one fell swoop. The indigenous community is the cornerstone of this project, though. Without their involvement, without their advocacy, without listening to them, this project would never have happened. And they really are the critical partner in getting this project done. And so just to give you an idea where this is, in the top left here in the northwestern corner of the United States, this is the Klamath Valley. These 4 dams stretch across the middle of the watershed, or catchment. It's a kind of an upside-down catchment. There's a lot of flatter streams at the top end. They become steeper as you move down valley. And that transition zone was a great place to put a dam in. And so these dams were used for hydroelectric power. They weren't used for water as a source of water. They weren't used for agriculture. They were only in there for hydropower. But by taking out these dams, we were able to open up about 600 kilometers of tributaries upstream. And this is habitat for salmon. This is habitat for lamprey. This is habitat for suckerfish. And those are all very important fish to these indigenous communities. The reason that these dams needed to come out is because they were impairing water quality. So not only within the reservoirs themselves, but they had downstream effects from the effects of the growth of this algae. So the reservoirs would heat up, this toxic algae, cyanobacter, would grow in the reservoir, and then it would die and it would sink to the bottom. And it would cause the oxygen levels to deplete. And this created poor water conditions all the way from the dam to the Pacific Ocean. And after these dams were built, salmon populations started to decline. This was the 3rd largest salmon fishery in the United States before these dams were built. And afterwards, the salmon runs went down. They decreased on the order of 80, 90%. Some years, there were very, very few salmon coming back upriver. And the tribes that lived along this river identify themselves with the salmon. They say that they are salmon people. And when the salmon suffer, they suffer. And so obviously they were very strong advocates for the removal of these dams. Starting in the 1980s, they started talking to their local government representatives, other members of the community, to try to get these dams out. And not much happened in getting these dams removed until the early 2000s, when there was a fish kill in the river due to poor water quality. There's a lot of other issues at hand here. It could be a whole talk just discussing how the political nudge for this project occurred. There's a movie on Amazon Prime called A River Between Us. It talks about this story, it tells this story. It's a really, really interesting story, and I would encourage you, if you have access to Amazon, to watch this movie. It tells the story very clearly and I think very well in a concise manner. But anyway, 70,000 fish dead all along the banks of the river, and this was from the headwater streams where there's a lot of farming activity all the way down to the mouth of the Pacific Ocean. So that started to create some momentum, and then in 2010, the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement was signed. In 2016, that was updated to become the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement. And these documents were signed by the states of Oregon and California, signed by the Yurok and the Karuk tribes, who were the 2 main tribes advocating for its removal. There are several other tribes that were involved who are very, very important to this project and are still partners in the project today. And the Pacific Corps, the owner of the tribes, of the dams. And so this established an organization called the KRC, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, and their job is to oversee the funds that are used to remove the dams. And so fast forwarding ahead a little bit, we became involved with some of our project partners, and we're working for the company called Resource Environmental Solutions, who is responsible for the restoration of the reservoir footprints, right? So once the dams are drained, you're left with the reservoir footprint. And so we have to restore the streams, so that's our job, and then also the landscape that was once flooded. And so that organization is overseeing, KRC is overseeing that. And so what we did was we developed a plan, and this plan is called the Reservoir Area Management Plan, or the RAMP. So this governs how we're going to do the restoration, and this is taking in nature, this is, at its core, this is a nature-based solutions approach. This is an adaptive management approach. It's based on riverine processes. We're observing and we're measuring how these streams are responding to the removal of the reservoirs. So they're seeing flows now for the first time in 60 to 100 years. And that plan was developed with the tribe's input as well. And so we're relying on them for some of their knowledge to help guide us. This is an example of one of the tributaries, and this is a pretty tricky one to try to solve because this site is, the soil out here is very fine. It's naturally, this is an old lake bed. Even before the reservoirs were built, this is an old lacustrine valley. And the soils are fine. There's very little gravel. There's almost no cobble. So there's not much material out there that has a lot of resistance to flow shears. But the slope of this system is fairly steep. So it's the valley, the system itself is imparting a lot of energy on the bottom, but there's not a lot of resistance there to keep it from incising. And so we were out there one day walking with some of the tribal members, and they were kind enough to share some of their knowledge with us. And I asked one of the guys, well, what was going on here pre-colonization? And he told us a story about how this is the area where his ancestors would come, and they would gather in the fall to hunt beaver, waterfowl, and catch fish to get ready for the winter. And so those are some pretty big keys for us about what this landscape was like. So we knew that there was very likely a lot of beaver-influenced morphology out here, right? So if you concentrate the flow in a fairly narrow area, that's going to put more energy on the bottom than if you spread that water out and have shallower depth so that you can't set up that shear stress to start incising. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen out here right now post-removal. This is a view of this tributary, and this is what it's done in the year since since the reservoirs have been drained, is it has cut down not only through the old reservoir sediments, but it's now started to cut down through the old valley bottom floor. And there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of gravel in here, but there's not much, okay? There's certainly not enough to provide enough resistance to this. So we have a pretty good understanding of what needs to be done out here to keep this system from incising and what it is that we need to do to preserve it and kind of set it up for long-term success. If you go a little bit down valley of where this photograph was taken, this is what you see, all right? You've got water spread out. You've got multiple pathways. We've added several pieces of wood out here. Last summer we spent a day with a helicopter dropping large trees in the system, and they help break up some of the flow paths and slow the water down, create roughness, and do those things that help to capture some of this sediment movement on the landscape. But really what it is that we're doing is just spreading that water out, right? We're allowing for contact with much more of the floodplain and adjacent landscape. So we're looking at the entire landscape in our solution here. We're not just focusing on the stream itself. We're looking at call it the riverscape, the stream, its riparian corridor, and land beyond, anything that we can get water to touch. So our strategy is to try to get the water to touch as much of that as we can. And so this is an analog for what it is that we're going to do out here. So our solution is going to be to put in these, we call them beaver dam analogs, which are some low-lying structures that span the valley and then capture the water and materials that moves down and kind of drops it systematically as it moves down valley. There are some risks involved with these structures. There's some maintenance required with these structures. But ultimately, the hope is that someday the beaver will come back here. And instead of having these beaver dam analogs, they're just beaver dams. And the beaver take care of all the maintenance and then return it to what it was, 300-400 years ago. And this is an image of the upstream-most tributary. So these dams, the last dam was officially, the last bucket of soil was removed in August of last year. In October, 2 months later, we had Chinook salmon swim through these dam footprints all the way up to this tributary. This is the furthest upstream tributary. So they counted 6,000 Chinook salmon going past the old dam footprint in just 2 months, which is absolutely remarkable. The fish will figure it out. The fish are smarter than we give them credit for. And so it's a really, really nice story. And then this next year, we'll be going to construction, building it, putting in some of these beaver dam analogs to start that process of healing on the landscape. The last example I want to talk about this, so we talked about nature-based solutions as a floodplain, the tenet of floodplain connectivity, the tenet of traditional ecological knowledge. And the last one, and this is particularly important in urban areas, is sizing the channel, selecting the appropriate channel size. And this is related a little bit to floodplain connectivity, because if your channel gets too big, you're not allowing the water to get out in the floodplain. But the story here is we were given a project that was just upstream of another project that had been done a few years prior. And the designers who did the project downstream, they had a certain set of constraints that they had to adhere to. So this is in no way meant to be a criticism of what they did, because I understand how they got there. But their channel that they built was about 4 times the size of what it was when they got out and did their assessment of the site. So our channel was sized to the current state, to its current state. So our site was about 1/4 the size of the one down valley. And so that's an important distinction. That allows for a lot of these processes, these natural geomorphic processes, to occur on the site upstream that were not able to occur downstream. And so this culvert was a dividing point between the two sites. So this is what it looked like down valley. This is the size of this channel was 4 times what it, quote, needed to be. And so when you do that, you're confining all that energy dissipation to within the channel. So to compensate for that, you've got to put in some bigger rock. So this channel is held together with these, with these boulder structures. And then the banks are held together with these boulder walls. Like, this isn't natural. This isn't really nature-based. This is structural. This is civil engineering. This is absolutely necessary in for solving some problems, right? In certain situations, this is the only answer. That wasn't the case here, but it's an important lesson. In terms of following the natural evolution of streams, what they were doing is trying to arrest it in a degraded state, right? Just accepting the fact that this is going to continue to incise and enlarge, and we're just going to keep it there, right? We're going to lock it in. We're going to increase the resistance to shear stress. We're going to lock this channel in so that it doesn't move. And so what was happening on our site was we had some gravel accumulation that was causing some lateral migration. It was creating this really interesting root mass along the banks. And so this was some unique habitat. This system did not have a lot of wood in the channel. And so the fish didn't have a lot of places to hide. And so part of our design was to mimic these. In some places we preserved these, but where they were adjacent to critical infrastructure, we had to stabilize the stream and keep it from migrating. But we did it in a way where, kind of similar to what I described before, was all the wood was underwater, right? And so the banks are vegetated, and if you stabilize your toe, that's usually where the process of bank retreat starts, is at the toe. So we stabilize the toe using wood, then the bank can't retreat behind it if we stabilize the toe. And so this is what it looks like post-project. Again, we have some floodplain connectivity. This is a bank with the submerged wood, so there's wood all along the toe of this. You just can't see it because it's all underwater. And then another element that we included was some floodplain assemblages. And we connected these with some seeps on the edge here. You can see there's some water, some seeps. But the payoff for this is when we get a big flood. So a big flood occurred shortly after construction, and this is what it looked like on our site. The water spread all across the park bottom. But if you go downstream, it's still confined within the channel. It still has another foot or two of rise to go to get out onto the floodplain. And so again, all that energy dissipation is happening inside the bed. And so they've lined the bed with a bunch of boulders, right? I mean, this is stuff that we did as well back in the early 2000s. So, a lot of us are guilty of this approach. But that's what happens when you oversize a channel. You're cutting off the pathways for a lot of these natural processes to kind of do their thing. And another benefit that we saw was we get some racking of material as that water spreads across the floodplain. And it creates just some microtopography, some microhabitat opportunities for organisms to take up residence in. I do want to talk a little bit about some other approaches besides streams. I don't want this to just be about streams. So the restoration community is also doing a lot with wetlands, treatment wetlands. And this is going to be very familiar to a lot of you. But I kind of broke this down into really two primary types of treatment wetlands that we're using. And again, these are engineered wetlands. They're built to serve a particular purpose. So there's a lot sometimes going on underground that the normal person may not notice. The layperson may not notice when they walk by, but there's a lot happening underground. And so the one type is kind of a free water wetland where we're moving water across the top. It has the exchanges are happening with the atmosphere. There's contact with the atmosphere, but the plants within the wetland are doing a lot of work. They're uptaking a lot of the pollutants that we need to extract from the water column. We're also seeing some oxidation, adsorption, degradation. Those types of chemical processes and biological processes are occurring within these wetlands as well. And the other option is a subsurface flow. So this generally has some kind of a planting matrix on top, and then there's a filtration matrix below that and some kind of impervious layer beneath that. So we're confining the water kind of underground as it moves through these treatment systems. And we've done some of this in conjunction with our restoration work, where we've created these underground gravel and leaf matrix mixes that are completely submerged, and we link them from one bend in a creek to another. And so it's a slow-moving anoxic reaction zone, and so that helps with some of the water treatment objectives that we may have on a site. And then we are using nature-based solutions to solve a lot of our stormwater issues, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar. This is a project that's being done in New Orleans. And for those of you who don't know New Orleans, a lot of New Orleans is below sea level. And so the stormwater strategy there is to try to get water out as fast as possible, to get it out into the Mississippi River corridor. But what they are really wanting to do is to try to add more green infrastructure, and so we've come up with a hybrid approach that is retaining the low flow water on the landscape longer. So we're trying to keep water on the landscape for a longer duration, yet still providing a way for the higher flows to get out fairly quickly. And so it's a collection of kind of upstream green areas where there's a lot of infiltration, there's a lot of holding of the water, but connectivity to some downstream canals, and as those get bigger and bigger, what we're doing is providing some green infrastructure on the margins of these conveyance ways, all right? So it's in the form of bioswales. We'll have some bump outs which can serve as kind of alcoves. But really it's a way of connecting more green infrastructure with the conveyance ways in New Orleans. And it's a fairly unique approach to solving two problems at once, but obviously nature-based solutions is a key component of that. So, this was alluded to yesterday. 90% of New Zealand's wetlands are gone, and if we want to try to bring those back, employing some nature-based solutions is a very good way to do this. And if we incorporate that with some stream restoration approaches as well, particularly pulsing water out on the floodplains, and we can, we're still engineers, right? We can still do the math. We can still figure out, okay, how much is too much water? What's our expectation for inundation limits and duration and those kinds of things? But the objective, we add an objective on there. It's like, okay, we want to support these vegetation communities with water. So we, really, if we can keep the water on the landscape longer, good things are going to happen. Right? That's one of the central tenets that we're talking about here. So we're also dealing with some barriers to fish migration. So one of the things that we're doing a lot of, especially in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and up in Alaska, is culvert removals and culvert replacement projects. And what these do, these are sustainable ways to allow fish to migrate past these road crossings. They're most commonly road crossings, but ways of getting fish, from point A to point B through these road barriers. A lot of these crossings are restrictions to fish passage. They have to jump too high to get through. There's not enough depth of flow in the culvert going beneath the roadway or whatever. So there's a lot of issues with that. But the bottom line is, we've got a lot of problems to solve. We've got threatened wetlands. We've got degraded streams. There's a lot of problems out there that we need to solve. But nature-based solutions are a sustainable, they're a practical, they're an achievable way of solving these problems. And so I would encourage us as a community to think about ways that we can employ these types of solutions to our problems. It's a way of problem solving, right? It's how do we frame the problem? We need to understand what's happening on the landscape. How is the system responding to these changes? Why is the system responding to these changes? There's as that water moves across the landscape, be it a wetland or be it a stream, there's a response. It responds in a certain way. So we need to understand why that system is responding in that way. And then once we understand it, now we can start to do something about it, right? So that's really the cornerstone of the takeaway of nature-based solutions that I want to leave with you is, think about the system, about how it's performing, about how it's responding. Think of what you see as a response to some other processes that are happening, right? There's a reason why it's there. And if we seek first to understand that, it's going to increase our chances of solving it. And lastly, there's a lot of community benefits to employ nature-based solutions. I've listed a few here, but a lot of it is just getting people. One of our big opportunities is to get people back in contact with our streams and our wetlands and our aquatic waterways. There's a lot to be learned by just spending time out on these aquatic landscapes and looking and observing, measuring, and that opens up the door for all kinds of benefits for adults and for kids alike. So there's there's just a wealth of opportunities out there if we think about solving these problems from an understanding of how nature works naturally. The possibilities are endless. I've provided some resources up here. I'll leave this up here in case you want to take a picture of it, but there's some websites if you're interested in some further information about what's being done out there in the restoration community. There's a lot of good information out there available to you. And with that, that's it.
Superb. We kind of don't have time for questions, but I'm pretty sure has anyone got a pressing question? You're around for the day as well, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Has anyone got a pressing question? Look, I'm going to go to you. It's going to be a short question and an excellent and succinct answer.
Okay.
I think my question is complicated. Roanna Porcaro from GHD. Yes, a very impressive project. So for the dam restoration one,
Yes.
How structured was the consultation with the indigenous communities and how long did that last?
That's a good question. It started in the 1980s, and they're really the ones that started the process. So they've been involved at every stage of the way. They were involved with the negotiations with the, so they had to sign some agreements with the farmers in the area, had a say in how this was going to go down. But they were involved with all those negotiations and all those conversations. From the design perspective, they are partners in the design. They are reviewing our designs and providing us with input, with really, really valuable input. And the Yurok tribe will be the ones that are actually constructing the tributary restoration projects. So we'll be working with them this summer to do the restoration. And they've done a lot of restoration in this watershed, in this catchment. So they're very familiar with that. But yeah, they've been involved the whole way. And there's not been, I haven't been personally involved, but everything that I've been involved with has included input, meaningful input from all the indigenous tribes that are part of the project.
Brilliant. Great question, actually. Mike, thank you. We've got a lovely gift.